Hi, I'm Rob Vanstone, and welcome to the umpteenth edition of the Rider Rumblings video podcast. Murray McCormick is at his plush 17 square foot estate. Is it even possible to have 17 square feet? In East Regina. I'm admittedly still in bed. My wife is downstairs, and she's ordered me to go upstairs and not bother her for the rest of the day. So I'm in bed, and Murray's leading a productive professional life. And my glasses, I hope, are straight. Myriad issues to discuss with regards to the Saskatchewan-roughriders. Free agency period opens Tuesday, February 9th. There's already some big news in that Charleston Hughes has been released and subsequently signed by the Toronto Argonauts. And will all this be for naught? Will there even be a season? There's a lot to chew on here. So, Murr, I'm just going to defer to you and listen to your answers to all this. This is Murray McCormick with us, obviously. Murr, what are your thoughts off the top on the Charleston Hughes situation? You had an opportunity to chat with him on Wednesday when the news came down that he'd been released by the Rough Riders after an impasse in negotiations.
I've had more time to kind of chew on this baby, and I'm not surprised. I think it all came down to money and want. I think Charleston wanted more money than the Riders are willing to offer. Well, it wasn't. He wanted a pay cut. He wanted to do that. And I just don't think the Riders really wanted him back. I kind of like the fact that they have this depth of A.C. Leonard, Freddie Bishop III, Chad Jeter, and a host of others behind him, that for the amount of money they've saved on Charleston Hughes, they may be able to go open the books up and get a couple linebackers now, which is really a big spot. So maybe they can open the bank and get Cameron Judge here. I think was probably a bigger need right now than maybe Charleston Hughes. Same token, I know what they're losing in Charleston Hughes. You don't take away one of the league's premier pass rushers and not pay some clear price, but I kind of feel I think O'Day might have the players in position to help fill that hole, but I don't think we're ever going to replace him, even though he was 37, Rob.
I'm not sure that they have the kind of dominant pass rusher that they need. A.C. Leonard really played well at time, especially as the 2019 season progressed. He was dominant in the playoff game against Winnipeg. But it helps to have Charleston Hughes on the other side. Do they have anyone who's poised to step into the position of primary pass rusher as opposed to being a complement to Charleston Hughes? Somehow they've got to get that type of player. If they don't have Charleston Hughes, you better do something to address that. I remember after the 2001 season, the Riders had lost George White to the National Football League, and the questions were, oh my goodness, how are they going to replace George White? He's tremendous. Well, Roy Shivers found Reggie Hunt. And when George White eventually did return, he was hardly even played. So they need that kind of magic. They were able to survive losing Willie Jefferson to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, at least from the standpoint that they were the league's co-leaders in sacks when there were games. But Willie Jefferson and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers ended up winning the West Division final at Mosaic Stadium and the Grey Cup. So they still had a ferocious pass rush even without Willie Jefferson. But now they don't have Jefferson, nor do they have Charleston Hughes. And albeit a 37-year-old version, they, by hook or by crook, they got to find that type of player. They may have him already, but right now there's simply uncertainty.
And I really don't think there's a lot in free agency. It's really going to be dominant guy up there at the defensive end. I know you asked me yesterday who are the dominant defensive ends in free agency, and I really didn't have a list.
Cordero Law and
Alex Bazzi's name I have looked at. I think there's more of a dominant player in the interior defensive line than Amando Sewell. The Riders have, Mac Henry and they have Shabil DeBuyer and, two Canadians that might give an option. But you put in a guy like Amando Sewell, and he's a beast in the middle. He's a beast as a defensive tackle. I know people feel the Micah Johnson experiment in 2018 didn't work out, but there had to be some reason why Charleston Hughes was getting free so much, and I wonder if teams are double teaming Micah Johnson more and kind of saying Charleston Hughes beat us on your own, and he showed him he could beat him. So Amando Sewell might be an interesting fit in the middle where you have, the kind of players like Leonard and Jeter and Bishop on the other side. a good point to make about Freddie Bishop. He had, was it 11 sacks in 15, Rob? I'm just,
Yeah, Calgary.
I
Six.
guess it was on the other defensive end side, was Charleston Hughes. So that's kind of a, you kind of see Charleston Hughes had a way of making the other ends better, even though I don't know if he drew as much attention, but AC Leonard had the opportunity because the teams had to be aware of Charleston Hughes. So there's that mix. Chad Jeter, man, I think it's kind of hard to remember a whole lot from 2019, but he had a pretty good, when he came here, he played pretty well. And he's also one of these guys, he stepped up. Charleston Hughes mentioned he thinks Jeter could be a good young gun who can really step up there. So maybe the players are in house, and if they're in house, then you have the money to spend on Cameron Judge and the talking middle linebacker. If they don't get Solomon Aluminium back,
Aluminium.
Aluminium,
Aluminium.
maybe they go for Enoch Mwamba. He's a little older, but he's had over 80 tackles the last 3 years.
And there's a ratio issue he could address if they don't get Cameron Judge back.
Right. And do they have to get Cameron Judge back? I would say yes. I think they need Cameron Judge back. And he could play middle linebacker. Don't write that off. I think he's such a good weak side, but he could play middle. I think he played a little bit of the middle while there. And he's a good, and Micah Tights is another guy who might be an option as a Canadian there. But I think they got to get Cameron Judge. I don't know, Rob, maybe, and it's not sexy, but I know I'm kind of getting wandering here, but they need a right guard. They do have Braden Schramm, they do have Madeline Riley, who are 2 young prospects, but there's a Regina guy out there, Evan Johnson, who's with Red Blacks for 3 years, a first round pick when he came in the league, and he can play right guard. He's only 26. He's only been a left guard and stuff, but he could maybe be one of those guys you put in there, spend some money, and when Labatt eventually retires, maybe Evan Johnson could step in there. So 2 positions they could spend some money on, right guard and middle and linebacker. And they have that money now because Charleston Hughes is gone. And that gives them.
For most of my life, people have been suggesting that I spend money on right guard. So, John Hodge on 3 Down Nation reported earlier this week that the Riders are going great guns after Evan Johnson. And with Dakota Shepley now in the National Football League, that would be a logical area to shore up. You're also looking at some age issues, at least in the interior of the offensive line, with Brendan Labatt turning 35 later this year and Dan Clark about to turn 32. So there's some issues there that could require some attention.
Don't forget about Braden Schramm. Schramm, I think, dressed for 10 games. I don't know how many games he actually got in. She played. As I said, it's hard to remember 19. Can I show my age? But 19, it seems like a whole other.
You can remember 1919, Burr. You can remember 1919, can't you?
It's true, too. Sorry. But even, remember, the Riders took Madeline Riley in the first round last year in 2020 draft. So, they must have high hopes. He's another Saskatchewan guy, maybe starting out. So, and there's all the other names, all the American offensive lineman names that show up and stuff. Logan Ferland has been with the Thunder for years, but he's been coming on. So I think they can get away with depth, but I just think a player like Evan Johnson, and I agree with John Hodge. So when I had my previews, Evan Johnson's the guy that they should look at Hardy. It'd be a great signing. Saskatchewan boy, Regina kid, wants to play here. All these guys love to play here. So it'd be an interesting signing for sure. Maybe for talking holes, have you taken a long look at the punter and place kicker depth chart?
I don't think there'll be a huge problem getting John Ryan back. I spoke with Michael Ball the other day, and it sounds like he wants to play, and if he's going to play, he'll play here. Yeah. He won't be an issue because he's affluent. I was wrong, by the way. Dan Clark turns 33 later this year, not 32. Place kicker, better get Brett Lowther back.
Unless they want to spend all the money on.
Now, the issue with Lowther is which version are you getting, though? Are you getting the 2018 West Division All-Star who made 90% of his kicks, or are you getting the 2019 version that had one of the lowest percentages in the league? Albeit he was very good on clutch kicks, but his numbers were way down in 2019.
He had injuries, a hip injury, I seem to remember. Justin Medlock's out there, punter kicker, probably one of the best in the league. Do you spend some money on him?
Winnipeg, I think, will find a way to get him back. Winnipeg seems to get everybody they want to get.
They do, but man, wouldn't that be, you get Justin Medlock. Yeah.
honestly, and Matthew Shinetti talked about it the other day. Matthew Shinetti with TSN, and it's something I've written about a few times. The honor system's in place here, and this is a competitive dog eat dog business. This being professional football, and teams are pretty much policing themselves with regards to what cap they impose upon themselves. And the widespread speculation is that they're all spending at or close to the salary floor, but there's nothing to prevent them from spending another $600,000. So
go ahead.
You can honestly, if this gentleman's agreement, and I think there's already rumblings of discontent there, this gentleman's agreement could make one or two or three or four teams that are vigilantly compliant look or feel very foolish if the final numbers come out and somebody spent, say, $5.2, $5.3 million, and other teams are spending 4.75, 4.8. And if there's nothing to prevent them from doing it except the economy, the economic issues we're facing. But if somebody's determined to spend 5.3 million, and a lot of these teams have rich owners, what's to stop them? The league can't penalize them, and job security is based on wins and losses. I just in the absence of a compelling reason to adhere to this, I just wonder if it's a sucker's game.
I think, how about, I might be naive, but maybe the general managers heard what their bosses said and go, this is a pivotal year. You've got to spend to the floor. We've got to get through this season somehow. Don't go over the floor. And maybe they agree. Yes, maybe they're smart enough to realize if we spend to the cap, we may not have a league. We may not be able to go forward spending that much money. We know there's no gate revenue coming in. There's revenues are down, and teams have got to do what they could do to adapt if they want to have a season. And maybe these guys have decided, yeah, we want to have a season. We want to play football. We want to pay the players. We want to pay our coaches. We got to do what we got to do. And this gentleman's agreement might be the way to go. But I could be naive too, Rob. I'm not saying I'm 100%.
In the 90s, they had a salary cap. And supposedly they had an alleged salary cap anyway. And some teams adhered to it and other teams didn't. And it was supposedly in place there. Al Ford, such a great man, tried to adhere to the cap. But then you'd have teams with private owners and extravagant spending that ended up going bankrupt anyway. They'd still find the money to pay for quarterbacks that the Rough Riders couldn't afford, and then the Riders would end up subsidizing their salaries because the teams would be in receivership and reliant upon the league to bail them out. So this model has been tried, albeit in a different way and in the absence of a pandemic, but they've tried this gentleman's agreement thing, and ultimately it's a competitive business. It's dog eat dog, and job security is based on wins and losses. And at some point, maybe there won't be flagrant excesses here, but if let's say one team is spending 4.75 and another team is spending 4.9, that might be the difference between a Grey Cup and a first round playoff elimination. And there's nothing to prevent anybody from doing that except the honor system. And this is professional football. I don't really sense that there's going to be unanimity on this one.
That's true. But I think one of the things that may be adjusting free agency the other way, there's no big name quarterbacks that are being signed. Like, remember last year, all the names in year, 2019.
Now it's
that was just absurd. There was way too much money going out. And there's no quarterbacks out there like McLeod, Bethel Thompson. Okay, well, yeah, and maybe Michael O'Connor, Canadian, but there's no quarterback driving the salaries up. These are all just your other 11 guys on the field, like some good receivers, and we're here. Quarterbacks are still getting their money, but when you look at the money the quarterbacks are signing for, don't you think the league's become more realistic in paying its quarterbacks now instead of the $700,000 that Riley got and Bo Levi got and Trevor Harris?
It's still more realistic to a degree. You look at the Nick Arbuckle situation, and there's somebody who's looked promising at times, but you look at what Ottawa was initially prepared to pay him, and that was, I think, more than Cody Fajardo was going to get. So at times they have been unrealistic, and there's been a bit of a market correction, or a lot of a market correction. I still think there's a huge opportunity to slash some salaries with head coaches and GMs.
Yes.
You know, I still
sure
think they're
want to hear that.
of course for the players. If there is that kind of money, I don't know to what extent the coaches and GMs have taken salary cuts, but that's generally been a $300,000 a year plus job in both cases. I think they'd probably still be able to make ends meet on $200,000. If there's money, it should go to the players. What are president CEOs making? Nobody really knows. That should be public information, especially when dispensed by the 3 community-owned teams. It never will be. It's naive to think that there will be, but I don't want to see the cutting of salaries being on the backs of the players disproportionately. Everybody has to do their share, obviously, but in the case of Charleston Hughes, to hear him tell it, and Farhan Lalji of the TSN first reported this, and Charleston Hughes pretty much agreed with it on CKRM Sports Cage on Wednesday, they're about $15,000 apart. Yeah. That's not a huge gap there. And Charleston also mentioned something on CKRM about how the Rough Riders weren't willing to meet in the middle, leading Derek Taylor to speculate, I think with some justification, that you're talking about $7,500 difference here. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in the middle of the $15,000. So you lose a player of that caliber for that much money. Maybe you're right. Maybe they just made him an offer he could refuse.
You know, $15,000 could be 3 bonuses played to 3 players overall. 3 $5,000 bonuses to 3 other players that they might sign. Because don't forget, they're still going into free agency. They still have some eyes on guys. You know, they look at the money they might have been spending on Hughes and went, well, you know, we have some guys in free agency. We might be able to use this $5,000 or $15,000 signing bonus to get to come here, and we probably need them more than Hughes. So maybe it's kind of, you know, you and I, we're the last guys to talk about living on budgets.
Yeah, no kidding.
I guess there's some ways. Sometimes the budget you have to count for money coming in and going out. I guess I've heard rumors of that.
Don't we just have wives? That's a Marion and Chrysula issue.
Exactly. Yes. So maybe Jeremy O'Day is looking ahead, saying, we can't do this right now. We can't sign for that. And how much he got? He signed. I think Hughes signed for 2 years with the Argos. I haven't seen how much he signed for. It's interesting. He was on a Rod Peterson podcast, and his partner in his podcast business had an Argos shirt on, which I mentioned.
No force happening there whatsoever.
Yeah, that was fun. But also, a little side point, I think Charleston Hughes is going to need a new Twitter name. Because he can't be
so much for Saskatchewan.
Yeah, so he's going to have to find us. I know, maybe to look at this in a way, Charleston Hughes loved the Riders. You know, he was involved in the community. He did that football camp. Him and Matt Henry have a stonemason business and another side business, a lot of things going on. But he's from Michigan. His family's in Michigan. You know, what better team to sign for than the Argos when he's going to be, if he can get across the border and back, which is a whole other issue. But in a normal way, he's getting closer to his family. So maybe that works out for him and that, and good for him to do that. But I don't think
expensive. Derek Taylor pointed this out yesterday. It's a lot more expensive to live in Toronto than it is in Regina.
Oh,
the money he gains in terms of the contract get neutralized by simply trying to live in Toronto?
Yeah. But maybe the contract was so bad or so out of it that he couldn't accept it, and it came down to not even an impasse. He just said, "No, I can't take this contract," and he walks away. And the Riders gain some salary cap space, maybe on that, unless a 37-year-old defense. It's kind of interesting. We're talking about a 37-year-old defensive end this strongly, though, Rob. And I know he's a different style of athlete. He didn't play until he was a senior in high school. Didn't play football, so he doesn't have all of those football legs. He's been away for, when's the last game now? 14 months, 15 months, Rob, I think?
Yeah, November 17th.
And he played with a badly, basically a broken arm and a broken elbow. He's had that fixed, but he's 37. And I think people have to remember that that's 37. That's old. And regardless of how good a shape he's in.
35. Right? He's an outlaw. He led the league in sacks at 35.
It's age. He's defying age, and how long. And sometimes maybe you got to cut your. Wally Brono used to be great at that, cutting his losses before the player deteriorated or something. Or
was good at
so
that.
Maybe Jeremy O'Day jumped on that a little bit. it's kind of funny. People talk about forming a GoFundMe page to keep him with the Riders. I haven't heard much about that since he's,
I hope not.
you know,
Use GoFundMe to help a person or a family in need or a good cause, as opposed to a football player who's still going to make six figures during a pandemic. Honestly,
I think it's got to be a tough situation for Jeremy and the players because most of them haven't received any money since November 17th, other than their bonuses, and they have to be saying we want
we
some
got
player
served.
bonus. Serb, yeah, which is a little bit, or GWS, so that helps. But imagine working and not having a real check since November 17th, 2019. That has to be hard on them. And Jeremy Day has to be cognizant of that these guys they're loyal to him and they want money. They need money to live on. But I'd be interesting to see when they all come back to find out what they did to make a living during the maybe 20 or 24 months, the way the season's looking, what they did to keep going other than training and stuff like that.
When
But
you
it's
look at the
just
Riders as a whole, we've talked a lot about the defensive line, a little bit about the offensive line. Assessing them going into free agency, I mean, their offense, there really isn't a lot to. I mean, they've got six quarterbacks. It might be a matter of reduction before anything on offense. Receiving core looks good. They may need if William Powell at 33 doesn't have what he had at 31, there might be a need to make a change there. But you look at the defense, and that's the looming concern, at least for the front. Defensive back, no issues there. That's a really good defensive backfield. Linebackers, no linebackers there. At least starters. And you alluded to it earlier. I wonder if Jeremy O'Day played his hand a little bit when he signed when he signed Micah Johnson and opted to give the big money to Micah Johnson as opposed to Willie Jefferson. Does that signal that an interior lineman is more of a priority than a defensive end? And that could be from the perspective of a former center who have to block defensive tackles all the time, so we'd have a pretty good idea of the relative value or comparative value of a defensive tackle compared to a defensive end. And there are some good defensive tackles on the market, so maybe it's a redistribution of money on the defensive line as opposed to just not addressing the line as a whole. Maybe they want more of a push up the middle. As it stands, they've got Canadians up the middle and no more Zach Evans. So perhaps, then again, they've signed a lot of big defensive tackles during the offseason, so maybe that's their route as well. But did Jeremy O'Day play that hand a little bit with the Micah Johnson versus Willie Jefferson situation?
Yeah, I think it might be an indication of how he thinks. I think more than overplaying his hand, that you have a guy coming up the middle like Micah Johnson was. He didn't have the statistical year last in 19, but boy, I think he was still effective. I still remember drawing double teams more and more down the side. He just couldn't get away from teams. So maybe, like I said, Armando Sewell, I can't remember how old he is.
He was a double team with Calgary, and he still produced numerically a lot better than he did here.
But I still think he's had a bigger impact.
All of a sudden, they're going to double team like Micah Johnson as soon as he ends up in Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
He should have been accustomed to that.
Yeah, and I think he still took those two guys away, and maybe that's why Charleston Hughes is so available. And I don't think Mac Henry and I think Shabrell, Mac's going to be 34 this year. Yeah,
34.
And Shabrell is one of those lower draft picks who's managed to. When he played, he was pretty stolid, pretty good in the middle. So you had Sewell to that, or some other one of these. To me, 1,000 names of guys on the defensive line on the roster. Maybe they find a guy in there, and you have a good rotation because you have to have three of them, eh? Just like you have to have three defensive ends. No one plays with just two defensive ends anymore. They all have a rotation, and that's when they, remember back in the day, they kind of had Charleston on a pitch count back in the day a little bit, just because they were a little worried about him wearing down. So maybe you get a guy like Jeter who can go every down and back. I really think they're in good shape going into free agency. Brendan Tammon says you go into free agency to either change your team or you can supplement your team. And I think the way they're looking now is a lot of these ones, other than linebackers and right guard and some special teams players, they're looking guys supplement things to kind of boost things, maybe special teams and those kind of things, which isn't in a bad spot to go into free agency. Well, we're going to be I can't remember when quarterbacks were at the top of the list when you're talking about free agency. I can't remember one like that. I don't know, Rob, if you.
2019, it was all about quarterbacks.
I know. So and this
Only
year, it's not even a mention. It's not even like, the Riders, they have six quarterbacks. They have Fajardo, they have Harker, they have Franklin. So they have three guys who can be on the spot, who can be whatever they want to have, starter and two backups. And then you have Fine, and then what's his other name? Sorry, Fine,
Tom Flacco,
and Tom Flacco. Three young guys you can bring up and maybe start developing and keep that sort of rotation going. So I think we got to give Jeremy credit for doing some good things at quarterback to make sure they had the position covered. And you talk about he's no center. He was used to taking on defensive tackles. He's done a good job on the receiving core. I don't think the Riders even have to look at another receiver. They're set at that position and just let go on the Canadians. And I've read that Braden Linnaeus has lost 30 pounds. So he might be that wide side Canadian receiver they've been looking for.
There's Justin McInnes. Who knows? They might a couple of Canadians. Yeah. Jake Hardy is back in the mix if he can stay healthy. There's Mitch Picton. So maybe they've got some options Canadian-wise in terms of receivers. Who's out there for linebackers, Murr?
Well, Enoch Mwamba is one I mentioned. There's actually quite an extensive list, and I'm a little older than you think. Can I look at my papers here? Sorry.
No. You should have this committed to memory, including their birth dates and social insurance numbers.
I sure did. I'll use them at the defensive backs. No, sorry. I came up with, if I'm the Riders GM and I got to pick a linebacker I'm going to play, I would go after Enoch Mwamba if they don't re-sign Solly. I think that. I've always been a Patrick Levels fan. I think he's a strong side linebacker. He may not be in the Derek Moncrief type dominating type position, but he can still play, and he can play a bit of defensive back, so he kind of helps out. Mike Oz, another guy. Larry Dean could be solid in the middle if you want to go that American way, and Justin Tuggle. So there's
Larry Dean would take care of that pretty quickly.
Sorry?
Larry Dean would take care of that void pretty quickly.
Yeah. So I think there's options out there among the linebackers, and but they have they're Canadian. Even the Riders have some good ones. I think Micah Tights was a good guy. He came on strong. He played pretty well. Sean Odoa. Odoa? I belong in Odoa. He was a good linebacker. He played pretty well last year. Maybe you got Jerry Johnson Jr. is another guy that can maybe step up there. So they have some in-house options, which I think is, if I look through all of the free agents and all of their rosters, I think O'Day is kind of giving himself options other than a place.
What do they do for a kicker?
Pardon?
Like who's out there?
Justin Medlock begins and stops with him. I haven't seen another one. And he's
handles punting and place kicking if you do it, but
how much would you pay for him? How much would? And the Bombers don't seem to be handicapped by salary cap issues, but
which is what I have been harping on.
Yeah.
It's anyway. I've probably beaten that one into submission.
They could look for a returner in free agency because they really, they got Kyran Moore and Lucius Purifoy, but they don't have a real game breaker in there. But I've always been.
They can be game breakers if you use them exclusively as that, but they're too valuable as every down guys.
There's a guy who plays for the Tiger Cats, and I've always been a fan of Frankie Williams. I think he's such a great shutdown cornerback, and he was a special teams player of the year as a returner. But Hamilton wisely re-signed him. I thought he might be a guy they could go after. But
you can get a returner at U.S. college or an NFL cut, you would think.
You can find returners, just like you can find old sports writers anywhere you want. You can find a returner, you can find a running back. Can you find a Canadian right guard? Well, that's a whole other thing. I just think, I think we mentioned it earlier. They invested highly in Matlin Riley last year, 7th overall pick. They must have seen something good in him that maybe think that he could step up there in this year, maybe another year away. But so there's a little sort of depth there, that 6-man offensive line. No Dakota Shepley, but good for Dakota to get that opportunity to go play down south. I think he's earned it for sure. I take a drink here, though. We're talking a long time.
Now, a year ago at this time, we were talking a lot about free agency.
Yeah, same guys.
How do you see this evolving? Will all this be for naught again?
Well, it's not. How about a half knot?
The halves and the half knots.
Because
starting on time.
I know, and I'm not
vaccination rate.
I don't profess to be a doctor or a health officer or anything, but if we don't have more vaccines underway by May, it's not going to happen in May. I really think we've got to get more vaccines, and people got to do more buying into wearing masks and washing their hands and buying into finding. But even May, I think is optimistic, and I've read a lot of spots. They're talking Labor Day for a season. So yeah, maybe it's surreal. It's almost not surreal. I keep thinking it's like a make believe. Yeah, we're all writing our stories and I'm talking about there's going to be a 21 season, but in the back of my mind's going, there may not be a 21 season. So is this all, as you said, for naught or half nots? Maybe I kind of like the idea is we have to approach it like it's real, just like the teams are, but back of your mind, where's this in your mind, Rob? I don't know.
I don't know. I mean, when Randy Ambrosi, last time he spoke to the media or the fans as a group without issuing a statement, I mean, one of the first things he said was talking about how the vaccine gave everybody some hope, and sure it does. But the latest news on the vaccines does not provide much reassurance. The news about the variants might get here long before a lot of the people are inoculated. It might just delay the whole process. I'm really losing confidence. I just wonder if the league is ultimately going to have to decide to go ahead and just bite the bullet financially. That might be the only option. That's what they were unprepared to do last fall or late last summer. They didn't get the federal government funding, and ultimately decided that would not be feasible to proceed with the season. I think if you're CFL people, you've just got to go ahead and play. If you're out of the loop for 2 years, I think the word obsolete, irrelevant is another one that comes to mind. They've got to find a way to get something in this year. So the most optimism I can find is related to what I think would be the imperative from the standpoint of CFL officials and team officials. You just got to play somehow, even if it's a 6-game season and comparable in duration to what they were proposing as a bare bones scenario last year. They've got to do that. I think anything resembling a normal season with training camp in May and preseason games and regular season games in June, that's fantasy football.
Do they have any bullets to bite on, though?
Yeah.
What have they been doing to keep themselves going? Like we just read, the league office has laid off 10 people and they're making cuts, and teams have made cuts, and they've done everything to get I think they've done everything to get as bare bones as they can, other than coaches and presidents and general managers' salaries, which have taken a bit of hit. I was going to mention Scott Milanovich got $600,000 to coach the Eskimos. Really? Doesn't that seem like exorbitant for a coach?
That's the way the CFL was going, though. I mean, they were beyond. They were in a precarious financial situation before the pandemic hit. And Randy Ambrosi said last spring that the teams as a collective lose between $10 and $20 million per year. And that was before the pandemic. And that's because of spending like that. And they spending, on several $100,000 on unproven quarterbacks, spending on presidents, CEOs. They have to get their finances in order first. But I wonder if the federal government wasn't the answer that last time. Are the provincial governments an answer? If you look at where the community-owned teams are based, Winnipeg, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, maybe those are areas where the CFL is a big enough deal that maybe the Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta governments could be coerced into handing over some money. The Saskatchewan government's already done it for junior hockey. And then if you look at the privately owned teams, those teams are probably privately owned because they've got rich owners. So if the publicly owned or community-owned teams can get some government money, having the community-owned card to play, and if the privately owned teams are presumably owned by people who have the wherewithal to take a bit of a hit, maybe that's how you do it. Just get yourself through a year. Get government money where you can get it provincially, and bite the bullet as privately owned teams, and just get through it, and hopefully live to fight another day or another season in 2022.
Yeah.
If looking at if look at it from this perspective of the provincial government in Saskatchewan, why wouldn't they accede to the wishes of the Rough Riders? They traditionally have in the past, regardless of the political affiliation, and they've got a lot invested in that stadium. If that stadium is empty, it takes longer for it to be paid off. So you've got to. Granted, there wouldn't be gate receipts this year, but if you don't sustain the Rough Riders through this season, is there a next season or a season after that to even consider? And then who's paying the $100 million or nearly $100 million that's left to pay on the stadium, primarily through facility fees? The taxpayers get stuck with that. So in light of that as an alternative, I would think a provincial government bailout of the Rough Riders would be automatic. Maybe a comparable case can be made in Winnipeg and in Alberta.
But there's also other, we're talking about junior hockey, the Saskatchewan government. There's also other organizations and associations that are struggling with money too right now. And how can they justify saving the CFL when these other ones,
now with junior hockey, and including privately owned, they've given most of the junior hockey teams that receive provincial money. Well, it was the SJHL as a whole that received a disbursement from the province, and then each of the WHL teams received money individually. Each of the Saskatchewan WHL teams, 2 of them are privately owned, and each the Pats owners are all loaded financially. So they've given money to privately owned enterprises. I think the precedent's been set with that contribution to junior hockey. How do you say no to the Riders? They've never said no to the Riders before.
They've never said no.
So.
But one thing about the Riders and looking at the CFL in 2021, you and I go to games, and the fans aren't young anymore. There's some, but there's an aging group. Gray hairs are in, as you can say. So, who's the most susceptible to coronavirus right now are the older people and the older generations. And how comfortable are they going to feel going to games when they're doing everything they can to make sure they stay healthy, to see their grandkids grow up, see their kids grow up? And do they desperately want to go to a game and watch it? That's a big question in my mind. If people want to go and take a chance on things like that. But Rob, I know this is by no means least and no means last, but I would just like to say on behalf of all the reporters and stuff, all the outpouring of support we saw for Warren Woods. You and I were good friends with Warren. We've been with him for so long. It was so sad to see him die of coronavirus. I think, was he ever on Rider Rumblings? Do you ever think?
Yes, we did have Woodsy on Rider Rumblings.
And, and I think what you got with Woodsy is what you got, man. He was just as genuine and funny and warm and entertaining and everything. I don't know if I've ever saw him not smile except other on the golf course, and he would miss half a dozen shots on the hole. But I know it is Riders and stuff, but I really think that, I want to say something. Warren was such a great friend, and I miss him. I'm going to miss him a lot. And the press box, when we get into a press box again, it just won't be the same without hearing Wordsy's cackle from the back of the press box, or one of his tweets that doesn't make any sense, but kind of woodsy, or hearing him complain about the trains. But Saskatchewan lost a great one in Warren Woods recently, and it's our first Rider Rumbling since then. I just think maybe it's not last but not least, but he will always be remembered.
Well, the Rough Riders played the first day that STV Regina, which is now Global, went on the air, September 6th of 1987. And the Riders played Winnipeg that day, of course, and lost. Dave Ridgway kicked a 60-yard field goal, which was then a league record. And that was the first event that Warren Woods covered in Saskatchewan. It was the Riders-Bombers game, Labor Day weekend, 87. And later that night, he went on the air for the introductory Global News with, STV News with Joe Kropp at the anchor desk. So, I mean, right from day one, working in the Saskatchewan media, Woodsy was covering the Rough Riders. And in recent years, he could be found at the Lancaster doing Wandering Woodsy on the CJME CQM post-game show. And what he was, like you said, he wasn't any different off the air than he was on the air. Just a total natural, as genuine as it gets, a wonderful friend, a great man. And I hate to end it on such a sad note, but there's so many reasons to think about Woodsy and smile. And I'm sure many tributes will be paid to him at many sporting venues once we can actually gather at them and enjoy the competitions again. It's been a sad few weeks, a sad year primarily.
Well, I look back on the happy points with Woodsy, and I guess I should mention Woodsy and I both grew up in Sudbury, but we never met each other. We both worked in Timmins at one time, never met each other, and we came all the way to Regina in 1986, and we finally met each other and became great friends. So two great old Sudburyans who've grown old and gray. Well, Woody never got gray. He never dyed his hair. How's that on a happier note? He never dyed his hair, and it was dark, always dark. So he told me he never dyed it. I never doubt. Well, I doubted him a lot, but he always had that dark, full head of hair.
Something that important or anything. He was as honest and genuine as one could be, and it still hurts, and it's going to hurt for a while.
Anyway, Rob, on a happier, I guess happy. We'll be back next week sometime.
Yeah, to toss around next week. So I'm not sure what date we'll do this, but events will dictate that. But we'll hopefully have some better answers for you once the Rough Riders start diving into the free agency pool. And we look forward to chatting with everyone once again at that time. So Murr, thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Rob.
And thanks to Mark Melnichuk, who's ultimately producing this. So if you don't like this podcast, blame Mark. Murray and I absolve ourselves of any criticism. Thanks for your time today, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.